Hello, I thought it might be fun to demonstrate how I take a piece of rough-sawn lumber, like this black walnut here, and mill it down into a usable piece for projects. It all starts by initially trimming the piece of lumber to the desired length for the project. This is so that I don't mill any more than I need to, thereby reducing waste, because the offcut generated here can be used for another project in the future, such as a cutting board or a chess piece. Also, if the piece is longer than it needs to be, that's just more weight that I'm going to have to maneuver around the shop. Now I place the piece onto a sled that I've made that will run through my planer. And the whole purpose of the sled is to identify any twists or cups that the piece has. And as you can see, as I was pushing down on it, the piece was kind of had a little wobble to it. So I have to take shims and identify those spots where the board wants to move and shim it so that it'll stay put as it goes through the planer. And this allows the board to ride through the planer and not be shifting as it goes through, thereby creating a perfectly flat surface on the very top there on the face. Next, I take my hot glue gun and I just secure the shims to the board itself so they won't want to move as the board goes through the planer. And now I take the sled over to the planer and start running it through. The first several passes will only make contact with some parts of the board because the board itself isn't flat yet, but with each pass I get closer to flat, and so I just keep running it through and lowering the cutters bit by bit until we've established a perfect flat plane on that top face. Next it's just a matter of knocking off the shims that were hot glued onto the board. All I'm doing here is taking a moment to verify that that face is indeed nice and flat, so I just basically sight right down it and eyeball it, and if it looks really flat, then I'm happy with it and I move to the next step. The next step is fairly simple. All I do is I flip the flat face of the board over and use it as a reference surface to run through the planer again. By doing this, I'm able to create a perfectly flat, and more importantly, parallel face to the opposite side. It's similar to the previous step in that I take multiple passes, lowering the cutters each time, until I've milled the entire length of the face. When it's done, I'm left with two faces, which are not only individually flat, but collectively parallel. And this is imperative in this process because I'm not making a trapezoid, I'm making a rectangle. Now that I have two flat and parallel faces, I can focus on the sides. There are a lot of ways to do this, but my budget method is with a track saw. I used to try and run it through my table saw with a sled jig, but I found it was very challenging to control so much weight, and I'd always end up with a minor imperfection. That might not sound like a big deal, but when you're making multiple boards which will be glued together edge to edge, those minor imperfections are extremely noticeable. If the goal is to turn many boards into a larger panel, the seams at the edges have to be invisible, which means they have to be perfectly straight. The track saw is great because it's easy to set up. I lay the track down near the edge of the board and rip off just enough material to create a straight edge. Before moving on to the next step, I check and make sure that the edge is 90 degrees to the faces. At this point, there are two flat and parallel faces on the board, and one straight edge which is 90 degrees to the faces. The final step is to true up the final edge. The best way to do this is to run it through the table saw with a flat edge riding up against the fence. I have a love-hate relationship with my table saw. I love it because it's such a versatile tool and I accomplish so much with it, but I hate it because it's also the most dangerous tool in the shop. I really hope that I never lose my mild fear of this tool because I was born with 10 fingers and I'd like to die with 10. One final check just to make sure everything is true and 90 degrees on all the corners. And there you have it, a piece of black walnut ready for the project. There's really a deep sense of satisfaction in taking a piece of rough-sawn lumber, which is warped or cupped, and turning it into a beautifully smooth, sleek, and straight piece of wood. It's definitely a lot more work, but it saves lots of money in the long run, and in the end, when you look upon your finished projects, there's just that extra added bit of joy in seeing the final product. I hope you all enjoyed. Take care.